This is Trish Thomas-Mink, and today I'm going to tell you about the Cash-Landrum Incident. Betty Cash owned a diner in Dayton, Texas, just northeast of Houston. On December 29, 1980, Cash, Vicky Landrum, who was a waitress at her diner, also her friend, and Vicky's 7-year-old grandson, Colby, were out looking for an open bingo parlor. But because of the holidays, they found all three in their area closed. So they stopped to grab dinner at a restaurant, and then the trio headed home. Now they drove down FM 1485 through the piney woods. It was a little after 9 p.m. as they traveled, and this stretch of road was considered spooky by the locals. It was dark, and the pine trees rose alongside the two-lane highway like buildings. The night was clear, and when the women looked up, they saw a bright object in the sky just above the treetops. First, they dismissed the light. They thought it was a plane coming from the Houston International Airport. Now that's called the Bush International Airport. That was about 35 miles away. Within minutes, they came upon this bright white mass hovering about 60 feet above the center of this two-lane road. Vicky screamed and told Betty to turn. "It's coming right at us." Betty stopped the car at about 130 feet from the object. They could not see where the light came from, but then a cone-shaped flame emanated from underneath the mass. Betty Cash was a curious woman. She got out of the car to take a closer look as Vicky screamed at her to get back into the car. The craft appeared, and it was metallic, shaped like a diamond with blue lights all around the center. And at intervals the craft would shoot down a burst of flame toward the ground. Finally, Vicky Landrum got out of the car and called for Cash. It was about 5 minutes later that Cash returned to the Oldsmobile. When Betty Cash went to grab the metal door handle, she yanked her hand away as the handle was scorching hot. It took the skin right off her hand. The heat in the car was also unbearably hot as they watched the craft, which seemed to be struggling to gain altitude. Finally, as it shot up, a group of about 20-plus helicopters swooped in and surrounded the craft. Betty said they seemed to just rush in from all directions. It was like they were trying to encircle the thing. Later, Fort Hood would deny any knowledge of the helicopters. In fact, Fort Hood issued a public statement saying, "We don't know of any other place around here that would have that number of helicopters." The UFO finally moved southwest toward Houston, surrounded by all these helicopters, and Cash took Vicky and Colby home. Then she drove herself to her home as her hand was aching from the door handle. Now, when she got home, not only was her hand severely burned, but her face and neck area seemed to turn bright red from the exposure to the craft. The next day, she couldn't keep food down, and she had diarrhea. Within days, Betty Cash's hair fell out in clumps. Her eyelids and her lips became swollen. Vicky Landrum experienced similar symptoms, but mostly on the right side of her head, the side that was exposed to the UFO. Colby also had sunburn and blisters on his face. Both women were too frightened to go to the hospital. They were afraid nobody would believe them. There was nothing on the local news about any UFO. Now, over the next few days, Cash and Landrum's health got steadily worse, so all three of them visited a Houston hospital. Cash, who experienced the worst symptoms, spent about a month in total in the hospital and finally told her doctor what she experienced. She was relieved when he didn't dismiss her account of the incident. He diagnosed her with acute radiation exposure. He said of her story, "I don't think she would have made it up. And the other thing is, I don't think she could have made it up. She didn't know the symptoms of radiation exposure." Cash never fully recovered. She could not work, she did not have health insurance, and later she would develop breast cancer. Vicky Landrum, though not as badly affected, suffered the same issues as Betty. Colby had burns and blisters on his face and suffered eye problems. The women finally reached out to Senator Benson for answers and medical help. He connected them to Bergstrom Air Force Base, who not only did not help the women, but denied knowing anything about the event. Vicky Landrum said, "We went up there and they treated us very dirty." Vicky was a devoted Christian. She didn't even believe in extraterrestrials. What she believed is she was witnessing the end of the world. Later, John Schuessler, a founding member of MUFON, interviewed the women separately and took them back to the location of the sighting. Both went exactly to the spot and experienced severe emotional trauma, as neither had been back to that original spot. Schuessler said they broke down, they completely broke down. And he reported this about the condition of the trio. Vicky had lost about 30% of her hair and had large bald patches on her head. When it grew back, it was of a different texture. Colby lost only a small patch of hair on the crown of his head. This too grew back in time. Betty's injuries seemed even worse. She experienced a severe sunburn-like condition and developed large water blisters, some as large as golf balls, over her face, and they went over her neck. One of these covered her right eyelid and extended across her right temple. She also developed long-term aversion to warm water, sunlight, or any other heat sources. In the year following the encounter, she spent 5 periods in the hospital, 2 of those in intensive care. She lost over half of her hair on her head and also had skin eruptions, many as big as large coins, which leave permanent scars. Now, the military stonewalled Schuessler, but because of the Freedom Information Act of 1982, he found evidence, a smoking gun, as it were. He found a military report on Cash-Landrum. The conclusion was Mrs. Cash and Mrs. Landrum were credible. There was no perception that anyone was trying to exaggerate the truth. The women filed a lawsuit for $20 million against the military, stating they caused their injuries. In 1986, the suit was dismissed for lack of evidence. Betty Cash died in 1998, and Vicky Landrum died in 2007. The blacktop highway they drove down that night was dug up and replaced with concrete. The same with the trees on either side of the road. A witness stated that he came upon the area where it was blocked off with a sawhorse, and the crew was working in the dark. No paperwork on that project was ever found. So now when you drive down FM 1485, the trees closest to the road are shorter and newer. The only evidence was Betty's scorched Oldsmobile, and the military was very eager to buy that from her. Betty, Vicky, and Colby were not the only ones to see that strange UFO sighting that night. An off-duty Dayton police officer and his wife were driving home from Cleveland, Texas. They observed a number of CH-47 Chinook helicopters flying ahead. Also, another man living in Crosby also reported seeing a large number of helicopters fly overhead that night. Here's a couple of weird things. First, in April 1982, a CH-47 Chinook helicopter flew into Dayton for a public viewing. Vicky and Colby went there, and Colby started to have a reaction immediately upon seeing the craft, kind of like PTSD. So to ease his tensions, Vicky suggested that they stand in line and they go and they view the helicopter, so they did. When they were inside the craft, Vicky struck up a conversation with the pilot and relayed her experience in the piney woods. There was another person in the helicopter at the same time who heard the pilot say he was flying that night, that he had been set to check out a UFO near Huffman that was in trouble. Later, the pilot would deny it, but it was a strange coincidence. The last weird thing is, the day before the Dayton sighting in Great Britain was Rendlesham Forest incident occurred near Rendlesham Air Force Base. Now, were there shooting flames in Dayton the same as the dripping molten metal with intermittent flame in Rendlesham? 2 major sightings a day apart. Coincidence? How much did the Air Force know about these sightings? Were they extraterrestrials or experimental government planes? To this day, Many believe the Dayton experience was one of the most credible, and yet it is one of the least known.